Welcome to Clue 4 of our 2024 Mystery Quilt. For today's clue, you will need the medium fabric, the dark fabric, and the background fabric. Check your fabric key to make sure you have the correct fabrics. From the medium fabric, cut 2 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. From these strips, cut 4 rectangles that are 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches and 8 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. To cut the squares, I will usually cut on the 9-inch mark first and then backtrack to the 4.5-inch mark. From the dark fabric, we're going to cut the same strips, 2 strips 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. From those strips, we're cutting 4 rectangles, 4.5 by 8.5, and 8 squares, 4.5 by 4.5. The dark squares will go with the medium rectangles, and the medium squares will go with the dark rectangles. From the background fabric, cut 1 square that measures 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Put a square on one end of each of the rectangles. We need to sew corner to corner, starting at the center of the rectangle, moving to the corner. You can use diagonal seam tape or a similar product to help guide you. Or you can just draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of the square to be your stitching guide. Sew corner to corner right on the line. You can either trim the seam to 1/4 inch and move right on to pressing, or you can sew an extra line 1/2 inch away from the first line closer to the corner, and then cut in between the 2 sewing lines to get a spare 1/2 square triangle block to use in another project. If you use this method, you'll end up with 16 1/2 square triangle blocks that measure 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. Press these units towards the corner fabric. While I'm at the ironing board, I will also take the time to press the spare 1/2 square triangle blocks. Then I don't have to worry about doing it later. Now we're going to repeat that process and do the same thing on the other end of the rectangle. You will end up with 4 flying geese units that have dark corners on the medium fabric and 4 flying geese units that have medium corners on the dark fabric. If you have an alternative method for making flying geese units that you prefer, absolutely use it. I encourage you to make it your own way. I'm just using this and showing this method because it's my preferred method. The finished size of these flying geese is 4 inches by 8 inches, or before it's put into the quilt top, 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Once these are pressed, they should measure 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches. For the rest of the piecing in this block, use 1/4 inch seam allowances. Now we're going to combine the 2 flying geese units to make an arrow block. The arrow should be made with the dark fabric. Press these towards the point of the arrow, or you could press them from behind and press the seam open. Once pressed, these blocks should measure 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Now it's time to combine these arrow units with the background square that's 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches and the units from clue number 2. First, we're going to sew an arrow unit onto opposite sides of the background square. The arrow should point away from the center square. Next, we will sew the 4 blocks from clue number 2 onto opposite sides of 2 arrow blocks. The blocks from clue 2 should all point to the bottom of the arrow blocks. We are sewing 3 rows of 3 blocks. Press the center row towards the background fabric. Press the outer rows towards the blocks from clue number 2. Just 2 seams and clue number 4 is finished. Sew the rows together, making sure that the dark arrows always point away from the center. If pressed correctly, the seams where the blocks meet should nest together. You can press towards the center row, or if you prefer, you can press the seam open. Before I put everything away, I'm going to take the time right now to trim all my spare half square triangle blocks down to 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I like to keep up with trimming these blocks down to a standard size. That way, someday in the future, when I want to pull them out and use them for something else, they're all ready to go. Place the spare half-square triangle blocks and the folded 24.5-inch block into a bag for safekeeping. Store the bag with your remaining fabric and clues number 1 and 3. We will see you soon for clue number 5. If you need the pattern for this clue, you can push pause and take notes, or you can screenshot it to print it at home, or the pattern is in the files section of our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends. You can find it there and print it at home. We hope that you will hit the like button, leave a comment for us, tell us how you're doing on your mystery quilt, share the mystery with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!